This episode of Lex Out Loud is brought to you by my patrons, readers, and listeners. If you'd like to learn how to support this podcast, visit lexstarwalker.com/support. You're listening to episode 58 of Lex Out Loud, Writing Science Fiction. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. This show is a chronicle of my journey as a science fiction novelist. Hello and welcome back to the show, everyone. I am Lex Starwalker and I'm loud. This week, I'm back. I feel like I should apologize for the long hiatus since the last recording. However, to you, that apology would actually be a week late, or an episode late, I should say. Hopefully, I'll have this out by next week. But a day late and $1 short, because the last episode, episode 57, where I talked about style guides, I actually recorded that right before or right as I was getting sick, and I have been sick for over a month. So I got most of the way through the editing process of that episode before the illness really hit me. And then it just sat there for a month before I was able to finish it. So that's why there was quite a bit of downtime between episode 56 and number 57. But now I think I'm getting back on track, and I know what everyone is probably thinking, and no, it was not COVID, thankfully, though I think it was nearly as bad. It was just a really bad virus, or maybe a combination of more than one virus. It was just a really bad cold. I got one of those super colds that have been going around, and yeah, I could have won symptom bingo. I had every symptom I can think of other than nausea. And I never had nausea. Thank God for that. I'm very happy I didn't have to deal with that one. But I had everything else: congestion, runny nose, sneezing, sore throat, fever, a horrible, horrible cough. And yeah, I'm sure there's body aches. I'm sure there's other symptoms I'm forgetting. I literally had everything but nausea at some point during the thing. So yeah, that was over 4 weeks of being sick. And at some point, this virus developed into asthmatic bronchitis. So then I had that. And apologies if my voice still isn't right. It's probably not. I might be a little nasal sounding, or might be a little lower register than normal, because I'm not back to 100% yet. I'm still taking prescription medication, but I'm coming out of the fog, and I mean, I've done hardly nothing for the past 4 weeks except sit on my couch, feel sorry for myself, occasionally watch TV or read a book. I have gotten quite a few books read in the last month or so, but not much accomplished otherwise. Shout out to my wife, Nikki, who's really been picking up the slack around the house, because I've been pretty much worthless for the past 4 weeks, but starting to get better. I got together with a writing buddy yesterday for a couple hours, and that went okay. And today I'm actually going to be hopefully playing Mage for a few hours, so hopefully that'll go okay. So I'm slowly returning to life. Thought I'd try to record an episode today. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is some thoughts on novel pacing, and also on the thriller genre. But before I get to that, a couple things at the top of the show. First off, if you listen to last episode, you might remember at the beginning, I went on a bit about these YouTube strikes that I've been dealing with, and that is still happening. I still get one of those every couple days. But my prediction that I made in that episode has so far come to be true. So I'm not going to go into all that again. You can listen to episode 57 if you're wondering what I'm talking about. But I had predicted that when I disputed these copyright strikes, that the group, the Warner Media Group that was issuing these strikes would not actually respond to the dispute. They only have 30 days to do so, and if they don't, it just goes away. And sure enough, at this point, I think 3 or 4 of the few dozen disputes at this point have timed out and gone away. So, ultimately, this isn't going to matter. I'm not going to lose the few pennies of ad revenue I get from those videos over this because, again, it seems that no human being is involved with this, and they don't have the time to actually respond to people who dispute this. So these are all going to go away. I just have to, every time I get one of these copyright strikes, I have to take a few minutes to go through the dispute process. So if you are a YouTuber and you're experiencing this, I highly recommend that you dispute these because especially if it's coming from Warner Media Group or another big conglomerate like that, chances are really good that, no one is actually dealing with this as far as a human. And if you dispute it, it'll just go away in 30 days. And during that time, they hold the ad revenue in escrow. So when the dispute goes away, any revenue that might have accrued during that time goes back to you. And also, or of course, if they fight the dispute, then it would go to them if they win. But I just wanted to let you know that they're not responding to my disputes. So, but they continue to do the strikes. So once again, a sign that this is all automated and the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. But it is an annoyance, and I truly feel sorry for people who make a lot of YouTube content and have to deal with this way more than I do. But if you are one of those people, definitely fight the dispute as long as you're within the right, like I am, and it's not a legit dispute or a legit copyright strike. Fight it and it will go away. I like to talk about what I'm reading. As I said, I've read a lot of books since the last time I talked to you because I was sick and I couldn't do much else. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I've read some good books. I've read some not so good books. So instead, what I'm going to do is talk about 2 of my favorites. So one that I read, and I don't think this is a newer book. I'm not sure how old it is, but my wife picked it up for me at a used bookstore a while ago, is a little novel called Later by Stephen King. And I just thought I would mention it because of the new books I read during this time. It was my favorite. And also it was kind of cool. I was talking with a writing buddy yesterday, and we were talking about how we both feel that the most important part of a story or a novel is actually the characters. As readers and also as writers, we feel like that's the most important part. As readers, that's the part that we're most interested in. That's the part that's going to make it or break it for a story. And we both actually agreed that the most important part for us after that was actually setting. Of course, we both write sci-fi and fantasy. We write genre fiction. So maybe if you're doing contemporary fiction, maybe the setting wouldn't be so important. But for sci-fi or for fantasy, the setting's a pretty important part of the story. And for us as readers, after character is the most important part. And then, bringing up the rear is plot, which I find really interesting because, if you look at writers on Twitter, which again, anybody can say they're a writer on Twitter, so you don't really know how serious these people are. But just looking at people who say they're writers on Twitter, it seems like a lot of them are very focused on plot, and that seems to be what they spend a lot of their energy on. But at least for me as a reader, it's the least important part of a story. And, there's been all kinds of things said about, there's only really 7 plots, or people give different numbers. But the reality is, you can't really write a novel these days and come up with a truly unique plot that no one's ever seen before. It's frankly impossible because every possible plot has already been done numerous times. You can come up with a unique setting. You can come up with unique characters, but plots, there's only so many different conflicts that there can be. There's only so many plots that you can come up with, and it's all been done. So that's one of the reasons I don't think it's the most important part of a story. Much more important are the characters, which are what the reader is going to relate to, and their kind of gateway into the story, if you will. And then the setting, where the story takes place, much more important. And then even before plot, I think more important than plot are actually the execution of the story. How well is it told? How well is it written? Things like that. I think all of those things are more important than the actual plot. And if you do all those things well, you can have a very, mediocre plot or a plot that's been done a million times, and it can still be a great story. On the flip side, you could have some amazing plot that maybe, people don't see a lot, or you found a really cool spin on it. But if your characters aren't believable or aren't relatable or aren't interesting, or the reader just doesn't care about them, it doesn't really matter. It's not going to be a good story. So yeah, that's really interesting. So this book Later by Stephen King is kind of a great example of this in action, because the basic kind of premise or plot of the book is the main character can see dead people, or like the spirits of dead people after they die, and he can talk to them. And if he asks them a question, they have to tell him the truth. When they answer the question, they have to tell him the truth. And so what the book is really about is a friend / lover of the character's mother is a police detective, and she proceeds to basically use the main character and his ability to help her solve crimes. And that's kind of what the story is about. So, it's a great example of what I've been talking about here, because that's not anything approaching an original plot, right? Like we could all probably name at least a few, if not a good deal or a good number of examples of books, movies, TV shows, etc., that use that exact plot. Someone can interact and see dead people, and what comes out of that. I mean, The Sixth Sense comes to mind, right? The whole cliched, I see dead people, right? So that's been done so many times before. There's nothing new about that, nothing unique or innovative about it. And I would even go so far as to say that Stephen King's treatment of it, as far as how he uses it, isn't anything new either. And yet, it's a great book, and I really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed it much more than some other books I read over this illness, who maybe had much more interesting or different or weird plots that I hadn't seen so often before. But the characters weren't as well done. They weren't as interesting. The books weren't as well written, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I didn't enjoy them nearly as much. Later, I really enjoyed it. It was a great little book. And the characterization was done really well. It was a really good, deep POV. It's written in first person. And of course, it was extremely well written, because that's what Stephen King does. So yeah, that's a perfect example of, you can take a plot that's been done hundreds, thousands of times before. You don't even have to do anything new or different or unique with it. And you can still tell a really great story that people want to read, just by having good characters and a good POV and executing really well on what you're doing. The other book I'm actually just starting is a book I've read once before, and I'm reading it again, and that is Ancillary Justice by Ann Leckie. This is just one of my favorite science fiction books that I've read, and I've been wanting to read it again. And for reasons I won't divulge, because I don't want to spoil anything, I've decided to read it again now, because I'm beginning work on the next book in my Cylinder City saga. And I'm kind of reading this book sort of as research for that, or as inspiration for that. Which actually this book has already been inspiration for some elements of the first book of my series, Critical Balance. So yeah, I wanted to read it again, so it was fresh in my mind, so I can be clear on it as a reference, so that I can, allow myself to be inspired by it, maybe get some ideas from it, but at the same time, I don't want to get too close to that source material. And it's been long enough since I read it that I kind of just remember general ideas. So without reading it, I think it's very possible I could end up doing something too similar to what Ann Leckie does with the certain elements I'm interested in without meaning to or realizing it. So I definitely don't want that to happen. So I'm going to read it again, and I'm really looking forward to it. It's the first book of a series, so I'm not sure if I'll read the entire series again or not, but I'm definitely going to read the first book, Ancillary Justice. So if you would like to check either of those books out, Later by Stephen King or Ancillary Justice by Ann Leckie, I will have links to them on Amazon in the show notes, and those are referral links. So if you want to click on one of those and then go buy that or anything else on Amazon, will help me out a little bit, and I greatly appreciate it. As far as what I'm watching right now, I'm watching and have been watching a lot of stuff. Again, like the books, some of it great, some of it not so great. But I will talk about two things that I've been watching that are really great, that I've been really enjoying. First of all, is a show I probably talked about on the show before, Star Trek Strange New Worlds. I've been really, really excited about this show ever since they announced it over a year ago, and been just chomping at the bit waiting for this show. And it's out. I think episode 6 is coming out this week as of recording. I've seen the first 5, and every single episode has been fantastic. Everything about that show is fantastic. The title sequence gives me chills. The visuals are gorgeous. The Enterprise is gorgeous. It's very reminiscent of the design of the Enterprise from the motion pictures, from the movies. Star Trek 1 through 6, I think. And it just looks great. The whole look of the show is great. They've done this fantastic kind of blend of the 60s style from the original series with our more modern style. And they've found this kind of fusion that just works. Just everything about the show is fantastic. Great writing, great directing, great acting. I really love all the characters, even the new characters. I mean, there's some characters we already know, like Kirk and Spock and Number One. But then they're new characters. And, I knew I was going to like Kirk and Spock and Number One because they were pretty prominent in one of the seasons of Discovery. And it's the same characters, same actors. But, I wasn't so sure about the new characters. And, they're awesome. I love them all. And they're actually in the show, Nurse Chapel is a pretty major character. And, I don't want to throw shade at Discovery or anything, or at least not too much. But I have to say, not only is Strange New Worlds the Star Trek I've been wanting since, what was it, Enterprise was over. This is very much in the vein of the original series or Next Generation or Enterprise. It's about a ship out exploring space, planet of the week, alien of the week kind of thing. It's episodic mostly. And that's what I've been wanting. And, Discovery didn't deliver that. Picard didn't deliver that. I mean, Discovery's an okay show. Picard's a pretty great show. But they're not, classic Star Trek in that way. They're not really what I was wanting. They're not really scratching that itch. Lower Decks is a great show. I really like Lower Decks. It's a lot of fun, but it's not really Star Trek either. I really hope it's not canon, actually. It's a really goofy, funny, silly show. It's a great comedy that honors Star Trek while at the same time making fun of it. And it's a lot of fun. I love it. I suffered through an episode or two of the, what's the cartoon? The one for kids, Prodigy, I think. And, that was terrible. But anyway, so, Discovery's okay. It's not great. I liked the first, I don't know, I think 2 or 3 seasons more, up to the point where we meet the Enterprise crew. I liked it quite a bit up to that point. And then when that season ended, I'm not sure if that was season 3. Since then, for me, it's really gone downhill. And it's more like there are elements of the show I like. Like I like, what's her name, Zora, the kind of AI that's living in the computer of the Discovery now. I really like that. But most of the rest of the show, it's just not my cup of tea lately. But one thing I will say is one criticism I've had of Discovery all along is they have a number of characters that have been on that show since the very beginning, since the first episode, that we still know practically nothing about. And they're bridge officer characters. I still don't know their names. I mean, we've been told their names. I just don't remember them. And you maybe know one little trivia thing about them, if that, and that's it. And, one thing that one of the many things that Strange New Worlds nailed is in the first episode, by the end of that first episode, I know all of these characters, including the brand new ones I'd never heard of before, much better than I do some of these bridge officer characters on Discovery that have been on the show since episode 1, and it's now like season 4 or something. So in one episode, Strange New Worlds was able to introduce and allow me to get to know these characters better than Discovery has managed over 4 seasons. So that's pretty amazing. And, to me, that's kind of a part of Star Trek. Like if you think about Next Generation, which the first episode of that was actually a double episode. But during that episode, we got to know all the characters. We were introduced to every single character on the show as far as the main characters. And by the end of that double episode, like, you knew who Data was, you knew who Worf was, you knew who Wesley was, like, you knew kind of what each character was. And Discovery didn't do that. And in some ways still hasn't done that, at least not to the degree that the other shows have done. Same thing, Deep Space Nine. After the pilot of Deep Space Nine, you knew who the characters were. I'm not so sure about the original series because it's been a while since I've seen that. And they didn't really, like, the first episode. Well, first of all, the first episode wasn't the pilot episode. And it just kind of just jumped into things. It didn't really, set out to like introduce everyone to you. It was just, I think a lot of it was just a different time. People approached TV differently back then, TV shows. But I highly recommend Strange New Worlds if you've been maybe behind on all these new Star Trek shows and now you're a little overwhelmed because there's so much. If you're wanting, what's the best one? What's the one to watch? It's Strange New Worlds. If you're wanting, what's the one that's closest to Next Generation or the original series? It's Strange New Worlds. So, I highly recommend it. I have no notes. I have no criticisms of it. My only criticism is there's not enough. I want more. I want more of everything. Oh, I have one tiny criticism. They need to do more with number 1. She's, at least so far, in most of the episodes, she's kind of been on the sidelines a lot. And, she's second in command of the ship. So I think they're a little unsure how to use both her and Spock. Because, obviously they want to do a lot of Spock because he's a fan favorite, but Spock is not at this point the first officer. He's a science officer. He's, I think, the second officer. So it seems like maybe the writers are a little unsure how to have, both Spock and number 1 there at the same time and have them both be relevant. My suggestion, not that any of them are listening or care what I think, but my suggestion would be to really look at Commander Riker from Next Generation and take some notes from Commander Riker and the role he played on that show for number 1 is kind of the liaison between the captain and the crew. And, that's a place she could fill that obviously Spock isn't going to do that. And that's a way they can maybe make her more relevant. So highly recommend that show. And then the other one is actually a documentary. This has been out for a while, but it's called The Wonderful Stories from the Space Station. And this is a documentary about the International Space Station, kind of goes through the history of it. And it's really excellent, has interviews with a number of astronauts, and not just from the United States. They talk to at least a couple Russian cosmonauts. They talk to, I'm blanking on her name. Is it Samantha Cristoforetti from ESA from Italy? Trying to think. They talked to an astronaut from JAXA from Japan. I can't remember his name, but it's really an excellent documentary if you're curious about the International Space Station and all that, and also it's worth it just for the cinematography, for the visuals. There's just so much awesome footage from the space station of Earth and space, and just gorgeous, really moving imagery. I highly recommend it. Again, it's called The Wonderful. It's on Netflix and Amazon if you have either of those. And I believe you can also watch it on YouTube. You can rent it. Like, you have to pay to rent it. But so Netflix, Amazon, or YouTube, you can check that out. It's a really great documentary about the space station. All right, so getting into our main topic today, which is kind of a dovetail of thoughts on novel pacing, my thoughts on novel pacing, and also thrillers, because for me, these two things really go well together. Now, at the very top of this, I want to say I am not a huge reader of thrillers. I'm not super well versed in the genre. And to be honest, most of what I know or think I know about thrillers, I've learned very recently through some discussions I've watched on them on YouTube, kind of from a writing perspective, as far as, what are the hallmarks of a thriller or how do you write a thriller, as well as a few thrillers that I've read recently, and then some books, some thrillers I read in the past that at the time I maybe didn't realize they were thrillers, but at least according to some sources I've found, are in fact thrillers. So if you are a big reader of thrillers or a writer of thrillers or a fan of thrillers, I want to apologize up front. It's possible I will get some things wrong or be a little off on some things as far as some of my understandings of what thrillers are or how they work or anything like that. And for that, I apologize. But again, I'm not a huge reader of them. I have read a few recently in an effort to get to know the genre better, and through that, I've discovered that they're really not my cup of tea. But that said, I do think that there are definitely things to learn from them, even if you're not going to write thrillers or they're not your cup of tea as a reader. And yeah, there's definitely some things I'm trying to take away from them that I want to use in my writing. So one of the hallmarks of a thriller is fast pacing. So they're known to be fast-paced books. They're known to be books that you either can't put it down or it's hard to put it down. And definitely the way they're written, the writer doesn't want you to put it down. They're usually, have a lot of suspense and tension, and they just keep going. They don't really give you much, if any, opportunity to catch your breath or slow down, or like I said, put the book down or anything like that. And, that is very much by design. That's part of what makes a thriller. And that's something that a writer of thrillers is very conscious of while they're writing. So yeah, there's a fast pace, and usually when a thriller's quote done right, you as a reader, you don't want to put it down. Also, interestingly, I recently learned that the thriller genre is the most popular adult fiction genre. So when you look at the subgenres of adult fiction, thriller is number one, and it's by a large margin. It's not even, nothing else is even close to the sales that thrillers get. So as I said, I haven't read a lot of thrillers, but when I learned that it was the most popular adult fiction genre, I suddenly became very curious about them. For one thing, I haven't read a lot of them, and I'm like, I might be really missing out here. This genre is very popular. And also, I have no data for this, but it seems to me that it's especially popular among people who, like, how do I say this? I think there are a lot of people who read thrillers that's all they read. Like you have people like me where I read a little bit of everything. My favorite's probably science fiction, but I read fantasy. I'll read horror. I'll read a mystery. I'll read nonfiction. I'll read contemporary fiction. I'll read literary fiction. I'll read a thriller. I'll read pretty much anything as long as it's well written and it's an interesting story or interesting characters. I definitely have my preferred genres, but I'm kind of open to reading everything. So you have readers like that, like me, or even more eclectic than I am. But then you have some readers that they, I've known people who only read urban fantasy or only read, epic fantasy or only read horror and things like that. And it does seem to me from just people I've known and what I've seen, that it does seem like there are a lot of thriller readers that's all they read thrillers and they don't read anything else, at least as far as fiction. But again, I don't have numbers to support that. That's just kind of my impression that I've gotten through life. So yeah, I thought, maybe I'm missing something out here. I should read some thrillers and see what they're about. And maybe I'll find a new genre that I really, really like. The other reason I was curious is, as a writer, all other things being equal, I would much rather write something that is very popular than something that is not popular, right? If I can write thrillers and I enjoy writing thrillers, from a business perspective, that would be better than writing science fiction, which is one of the least popular genres of adult fiction, right? Assuming I enjoyed writing thrillers. So I was curious. Another thing that kind of made me curious is when I was asking one of my alpha readers how they would classify my novel, and I was kind of thinking of, would you call this hard sci-fi? Would you call it a space opera? Would you call it mundane sci-fi, which I hate that term. I prefer realistic sci-fi, trying to get that to catch on. What would you call it? And they said that they might call it a sci-fi thriller. Now, again, like me, this is someone who is not reading thrillers all the time. I'm sure they've read some, but they're not, that's not their jam. So, they made that caveat. They're like, I don't read a lot of thrillers, so I maybe it's not a thriller, but to me, I could see it being classified that way. So that also made me curious to know more about thrillers, because I'm like, if my book is a sci-fi thriller, like that would be pretty cool, because it might give me more of an audience than if it's just plain sci-fi, because maybe, I'll draw in some of those multitudes of thriller thriller readers who might be like, oh, I'll try a sci-fi thriller. It's still a thriller, right? Like, for instance, The Martian is considered a thriller, and Ready Player One is considered a thriller, both of which are also science fiction, both of which I've actually read recently as part of my trying to read more thrillers. So yeah, I was like, maybe my book is a thriller and I don't even know it, which that would be cool. Or maybe my book is almost a thriller and I could make some tweaks to it here and there and make it a thriller. And, that might be worthwhile to do if it's already close, just because it is such a popular genre. So that was another reason I wanted to learn more about it. So as I said, I've read a few thrillers. And I'm still going to read some more, because I don't for a minute think that I've read enough of them that I could say with confidence that I know exactly what a thriller is. But I have, in the ones that I have read, seen commonalities. And also there are a couple movies that I've seen that are adaptations of books that were thrillers that are, when I was looking for lists of what are the best thrillers out there, because I was like, if I want to investigate this genre, I want to start with the ones that people are like, hey, if you're looking for a good example of a thriller, this is the best one. Like, I want to start with those books, like the real, the epitomes of thrillers. And a couple books that I often saw on those lists was the Da Vinci Code and Shawshank Redemption. So I have not read either of those, but I have seen the movies. Also, another one was Jurassic Park, which I've seen. And actually, I just recently rewatched with my wife while I was sick because she wanted to watch it. So, I know to some degree it's apples and oranges comparing books and movies, but those are three other examples of thrillers that I'm at least familiar with the movie adaptations. So from that and the books I've read, I feel like I do have I've kind of wrapped my brain around like kind of what is a thriller like, what are the common elements between all these stories. So that being said, I have discovered and learned about myself that as a reader, I actually don't particularly care for thrillers. I don't really enjoy reading them. I'd rather read something else. The thrillers that I have read, I would have enjoyed more as stories if they were not written as thrillers, if they did not do those things that thrillers do. I would have enjoyed them more. I would have enjoyed them, like, for instance, The Martian. I would have enjoyed that more if it would have been written more as a straight up sci-fi, which I have no idea when Andy Weir wrote that book if he was trying to write a thriller. I just know that's how it's classified. But regardless, if he would have written it more like, say, he wrote Artemis or Project Hail Mary, I would have enjoyed it more. The kind of hallmarks of a thriller, as far as a writer, the techniques you use to make a book a thriller, I don't enjoy as a reader, which is to say, I don't enjoy a book that I can't put it down or don't want to put it down. I don't enjoy a book that has kind of a fast, relentless pace throughout it. I don't enjoy a book that never gives you time to breathe. I don't really enjoy that. I don't enjoy a book that makes me want to read it in one sitting, usually, unless it's really short. Now, I want to say this is not a judgment of the genre. I'm not saying thrillers are bad or thrillers aren't as good as other kinds of books. I'm not bashing thrillers, not in any way. This is all a thing of personal taste, and I have just learned about my own taste, some things that we're illuminating that I want to share with you today. It doesn't matter if you agree with them or not. It's more a thing of learning what you like and what you don't like as a reader and also as a writer, and using that to inform what you're going to do. Nothing against the genre, nothing against people who write it. It's just not my cup of tea, not my favorite thing. So I thought I would go at this first from the perspective as a reader, and then from the perspective as a writer, and then I'll kind of pull it together. So first I'll talk about kind of my experience with thrillers as a reader. So as a reader, I really don't care for the fast pace, and I really don't care for a book that doesn't want me to ever put it down. I much prefer science fiction and, to a lesser degree, fantasy. And these are both genres that usually have a slower pace, if only because of the amount of world building that's required. If you're talking about a science fiction book or a fantasy book, more often than not, those are occurring in a setting other than, modern day Earth that we're familiar with. And so as part of that book, the author has to introduce you to the setting and explain various things to you. And that just takes words and time and pages to do. And it just is going to result in a slower pace. And I like that. I like a story that can breathe. I like it when a story gives me obvious points where I can take a break, put the book down, and come back to it later. And, if it's a good story, this also, when I put that book down, it gives me time to think about what's happened, what's going on, and what may be coming next, and thoughts that what's going on in the book have brought to mind, and to ponder these things. And for me, that's a very important part of the reading experience. And a book that doesn't give me that, I don't like as well. And, my experience with thrillers is they don't give me that, because they definitely don't want me to put it down. And if or when I do put it down, it's not really giving me anything to think about. I much prefer a story with more depth. My experience with thrillers is that they are somewhat shallow, for lack of a better term. And I don't mean that as an insult. I just can't think of a better way to say it. I always, when I'm reading a thriller, I feel like we're never going below the surface on anything. We don't get below the surface of the point of view character. We don't really get into their psyche. We don't see a lot of internal conflict. We don't see a lot of character growth, at least compared to other genres. And I think it's really because of the pacing. So what I mean here is things are going by so fast that basically the author has time to give you the gist of what's going on and kind of the top layer of what the POV character is thinking and experiencing. But there's not time to go deeper than that because that would slow the pace down. So because of this, I think these stories tend to focus much more on external conflict than internal conflict. They tend to be more stories of the main character overcoming a situation or a series of obstacles than they are stories about the main character going on a personal journey, growing as a person, learning about themselves, things like that. So personally, I much prefer stories where the main character grows as a person, where we see their deepest thoughts, where they learn things about themselves or they overcome things that have been holding them back. And I much prefer internal conflict to external conflict. I also enjoy stories where we can really dig into the setting and learn what's cool about it. What makes this place unique if we're talking about sci-fi or fantasy. I enjoy stories with vivid imagery, as long as we can accomplish this without descriptions getting too long and ponderous. So from what I've seen, thrillers just don't have time for this kind of thing. I was talking with the writing buddy about this the other day, and they made a really good point. Whether you're talking about a book or a movie, that when the thriller does need to convey information to you, it's just like, it just hits you over the head with it. It's like all at once, rapid fire. And a lot of times as a reader or the watcher of a movie, like you don't even really get it all, like, because it's not, there's no time to really explain anything. It's just like, boom, here it all is. And we're moving on. And a lot of times you're like, what? I don't think I understand all that. And now the main character is making, deductive leaps and decisions based on this information that was just thrown in your face. And you're not really completely understanding how they're able to do that, or at least not to the degree that you would in something that was slower paced where the author took the time to explain things more. I also, as a reader, I really, really appreciate good writing as long as it doesn't get too flowery or purple or pretentious or literary. I want a little bit more than he said this, she said that, and then this happened, which is how, the thrillers that I've read recently, that's how they feel to me. Like it's just very minimalist writing. Like there's little to no descriptions. It's just a lot of he said, she said, this happened, that happened. It's almost, in a way, it almost feels like I'm reading a summary of the story instead of the actual story, or like I'm getting the story from someone who heard it from someone else and they're forgetting all the little details. So the main ideas are there, but there just isn't a lot of detail or like I said before, there's not a lot of depth to it. It doesn't go very far down. It just keeps going forward. Also, it seems to me, in at least in the thrillers I've read recently, that there tends to be a lot more telling as opposed to showing. Now, I do want to mention here that one caveat to all this is if a book has interesting characters that I like and a compelling story or plot, that can make it for me. And really, that's more important to me than the writing style. So if a story has those two things going for it, if it's got interesting characters and an interesting story, then it can have a very simple, minimalistic writing style, and I'm fine with it. But it's when it doesn't have all those things that I start to notice that, and the writing is really it's not taking me anywhere. It's not making me feel anything. It's not making me see anything. It's just telling me what happened. If that makes sense. It's hard to explain. So speaking of interesting characters, I mean, that's really important too. I prefer multi-dimensional characters. And a lot of times in thrillers, the characters seem kind of one note, like almost like they're just an archetype. They're not very complex because again, there's just not time for that. Adding multiple dimensions to a character, making them really complex, that all increases your word count and it tends to slow down your pacing. So that's all from the perspective of a reader. Now, if I look at it as a writer, I mean, I think it's probably a safe assumption usually that, we normally prefer to write the kind of stories we like to read. I mean, I feel like that's a fair assumption. It may not always be true, but I feel like that's often true probably. But it is an assumption. So maybe it's not true or it's not always true. As a writer, I know there are a number of techniques and or gimmicks even that are used to keep a reader from putting a book down and to make a book feel fast-paced. So these are things like using short and simple sentences, keeping descriptions to a minimum and keeping them short, having a lot of action, having less introspection. Also, more dialogue as well, action and dialogue. So another of these techniques is what's called ending chapters on a button. For example, ending with a cliffhanger. So, the reader wants to keep reading instead of putting the book down at the end of the chapter. So this is just ending the chapter in such a way that the reader really wants to know what happens next and read the next chapter. So a classic example of this is at the end of a chapter, someone opens a door, but we don't find out what's behind the door until the beginning of the next chapter. So, any book can do this. A lot of books and a lot of genres do this to some degree. But this is a technique that's used a lot in thrillers, and, they'll do it more often. And some of them will even try to do something like this every chapter. So, there are thrillers that do a better job at this, these techniques, and ones that don't do such a great job. And, these techniques can be very ham-fisted. And when the writer lacks finesse in using them and or overuses them, it can be really annoying. So, as with a lot of things, it's all in how you execute. Now, as a general rule, I'm not really interested in using these techniques for the most part, and others like them throughout an entire book. Maybe here or there as the situation calls for, as it's dramatically appropriate, but I don't want to be doing this an entire book. As a sci-fi writer, I spend a lot of time building my setting and trying to make it interesting. So I want to share that with the reader as much as I can, while, of course, keeping it relevant to the story. I also want to share details about the characters. I don't want the need or the desire to keep a fast pace to limit me in sharing these kinds of details. All right, so I've kind of talked about kind of my thoughts on a thriller from the perspective of a reader and a writer, and how it's not really for me either way. So I thought I'd wrap this up by talking about the kind of pacing I do enjoy in a novel. So this is for me the ideal. And this applies both to me as a reader and as a writer. And to explain this, I will use the common conceptions of outlining the flow of a novel with the terms exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. You probably know these from your high school English class. And, I'll say that pretty much all of my favorite novels follow this pacing I'm about to talk about. And I have talked about this a bit on the show before. And I've learned this or discovered this through examining novels that I really like. So this isn't something I was taught in a class or that I heard someone else talk about. This is something that I've figured out just from reading books and looking at the books that I really like and how are they paced and what's going on. And I've found this kind of structure that exists in a lot of these books, and these books have this in common. So starting out with the exposition going into the rising action, during the exposition, I prefer a slower pace. I want to find out about the world, and I want to find out about the characters. If there's anything interesting about the world and the characters, I want to learn about it now in as much depth as is interesting without, it turning into an encyclopedia. As a writer, I can use, and as a reader, I'm happy to read longer sentences and paragraphs in this part of the book. There can be introspection and descriptions. I want to be able to put the book down at the end of a chapter. For me, this pacing ideally goes through the exposition and maybe about halfway or so through the rising action. It can kind of vary. It can go halfway through the rising action or 2/3, 3/4, but something like that. So as I talk about this through the different parts of a story, I'm going to use the analogy of driving a car. So if we were to compare this to driving a car, at the beginning of the story, the exposition, we get in the car, we start the engine, we take off, we start out slow, and we're slowly accelerating through this part of the book. We're accelerating through the exposition and through the first part of the rising action, the first half or a little more than half of the rising action. So we're starting slow, but we're starting to build up some momentum. As a writer, by the time I'm about halfway to 3/4 of the way through the rising action, I want to have explained everything I need to explain in the book, whether that's character or setting or whatever. And this will usually be about the halfway point of the book. At least for me, for the books I've read and the books I read, it seems about the halfway point of the book. You're getting about halfway, 3/4 of the way through the rising action. You're starting to approach the climax. So that's what comes next. We go from rising action to climax. So as we get to the second half of the rising action and we begin to approach the climax, I want the pacing to begin to speed up, and I want to speed up more. As we get nearer and nearer and then into the climax, sentences and paragraphs get shorter. We start seeing one-word sentences and one-word paragraph or one-sentence paragraphs, especially during the climax. Short and snappy. The closer we get to the climax, the less description and introspection we want to have. And the prose is more focused on action and dialogue. By the time we're actually in the climax, everything should have been explained and described. There ideally isn't the need to describe or explain anything during the climax unless we're maybe seeing something for the first time. But if that happens, if something comes up in the climax that we haven't seen before in the book and we need to describe it or explain it, we want to keep that as short and concise as possible. This section of the book I want paced more like a thriller. Ideally, the reader can't put the book down at this point. So we're talking end of the rising action through the climax. Now we're using those tools that the thriller writers use. We don't want the reader putting the book down. We want them hooked until the climax is resolved. For example, in my book, Critical Balance, I did have some chapters, not very many, a few though, that end on a cliffhanger or on a button like we talked about a little bit ago. And these all occurred either at the end of the rising action or during the climax. That's when I did that, and it was a conscious choice. I wasn't doing that during the exposition or the beginning of the rising action or the falling action. I was doing that pretty close to the climax, either before or during the climax. So going back to our car analogy, at this point we're in the second half of the rising action, we're approaching the climax. This is when we shift up to a higher gear and we're accelerating faster and faster toward the climax. Once we reach the climax, once we're there, we're in that climactic scene, we've got it floored. The pedals to the metal. All right, so the next phase of a story, we've now resolved the climax. We're into the falling action, going into resolution. So to continue our car analogy, once we're through the climax, once we've resolved the situation of the climax, we can ease off the gas again. We don't need to be going full out anymore. So now we're doing the same thing with our pacing that we did in the first half of the book, only we're going in reverse. So instead of, the first half we started slow and we accelerated towards the climax, now we're starting, full speed at the climax, and now we're decelerating toward the end of the book. So now that we're through the climax and we're into the falling action and we're going towards the resolution, the pacing slows down again and starts to look more and more like what we saw in the first half of the book. We can start using longer sentences and paragraphs again. We can have more descriptions and introspection as needed. So this is where, we've got past the climax. We're in the falling action now. This is where we see the consequences of what happened in the climax. Maybe there are changes to the setting and or the characters. I mean, there should be, at least to the characters, if not the setting too. So we take the time to describe those changes. Part of a story is at the beginning of a book, you begin with a status quo, right? And then something happens that shakes things up, which is what our story is about, disrupts the status quo and builds to a climax. The situation is dealt with, it's overcome, the obstacle is overcome, the situation is resolved. And now afterwards, we have a new status quo that has been established by whatever happened in the climax. So at this point in the book, the rising or the falling action going into the resolution, we take time to observe and examine the changes to our characters and the setting. And we have some introspection here so we can see how the characters react to these changes and how those changes impact them. If this is a series of books, this is also the time where we begin to sprinkle in some seeds for the next book. Maybe some loose ends that will be resolved in the next book, and or introducing some new elements, characters, events, etc., that we will deal with in the next book. If there are any unanswered questions or any promises to the reader that we've made that haven't been fulfilled yet, we do so at this time. And we give the reader a chance to recover from the climax and to absorb the new reality, the new status quo, and become comfortable with that. So again, going back to our car analogy, we're decelerating through the falling action and into the resolution. And at the end of the story, we park the car, we shut off the engine, we get out, and maybe we take a walk around the car to check out any scars or anything any way that the car has changed during its journey, and then we're done. So, to kind of wrap all this up, I think by now it's pretty clear that for me at least, it's not that I, quote, don't like the techniques used in a thriller. It's not that I don't like a fast pace in a story, but rather it's a matter of degree. I don't enjoy those techniques when they're used throughout a novel, as they often are in thrillers. It just wears me out, and it's not the experience I'm looking for or that I enjoy. As a reader, again, I want a story I can really sink my teeth into. I want something that's going to make me think. I want something that's going to make me feel something, that's maybe going to open my mind to a new idea or a new concept I haven't considered before. And I want there to be natural points in the story where I can close the book, put it down, and think about what just happened and think about what might be coming next or what the consequences of what just happened are. And a thriller not only does not invite you to do that, it actively is working to prevent you from doing that. And I just personally, as a reader, I don't enjoy that. I also don't or would not enjoy constantly using these techniques that thrillers use throughout an entire novel. Because honestly, to me, it would begin to feel too much like kind of like a paint by numbers kind of thing. It'd be a little too formulaic for me. And also because, like I said, I really like to dig into the characters, not only as a reader, but as a writer, and the setting and how what's happening in the story is impacting the characters in the setting and the changes that are occurring and really get into that. Not just a surface level, oh yeah, this happened, but let's explore it. However, if we talk about, some of these techniques that we see in thrillers, the techniques of fast pacing, short, simple sentences, keeping descriptions absent or to a minimum, having a lot of action and dialogue and not much or any introspection, ending chapters on buttons and cliffhangers and things like that. Those techniques for me are great for the end of the rising action and for the climax. I do want to do those things at that point in the book because, during the exposition and the beginning part of the rising action and during the falling action and the resolution, I'm fine with the reader putting the book down. I'm fine with the reader taking some time to think about things. I invite them to do that. But when we're nearing the end of the rising action and we're getting into the climax, and definitely during the climax, if I've done my job right as a writer, the reader really doesn't want to stop at that point. They want to at least find out how the climax resolves before they take a break. So at this part of the story, I want everything the thriller writer wants. I want fast pace, lots of action, little to no description or introspection. I want the reader to be totally hooked and unable to put the book down until that climax situation is resolved. And then, we can chill out again once we get into the falling action. Another thing, I don't have this in my notes, but another quick analogy, another thing I've noticed with thrillers is a lot of times there's not much falling action or resolution in a thriller. A lot of times the story ends pretty close after the climax is over. They will either completely skip falling action and resolution, or they will be very, very short. And that is something else that I, as a reader, I don't enjoy. Presumably, if I've finished a novel, because I am not someone, there are people who they feel like once they start a novel, they have to finish it, no matter how little they enjoy it. I'm not that person. I am totally willing to stop reading a novel after the first page, after first few pages, after the first chapter, after the first few chapters. I'll even stop. I've stopped novels halfway through. I've stopped novels 3/4 through. If I get to a point where I'm not enjoying myself anymore and I see little hope that that's going to change by the end of the book, I'll stop reading it. Life is too short. There are way too many good, awesome books out there for me to waste any time reading a book I don't enjoy. That's just how I think about it. So yeah, I'm not afraid to put a book down if I'm not digging it. So if I've gotten to the end of a novel, then it's because I really like the book. It's because I like the characters. It's because I like what's going on. I like the setting, whatever. And that being the case, I don't like it when a novel just hits the climax, resolves it, and it's done. It's out. These are characters I've grown to really like. This is a setting I really like. This is a story I've really enjoyed. I want some time with the characters after the situation is resolved, after the climax is over, to see, how does this impact their lives? How are their lives different after this? How are they changed as characters from what's happened? What are the consequences of what happened in the climax? What's the new status quo? What's life like now? I really hate it when, a book, a movie, a TV show, when the climax is over and it's just over. I want a nice leisurely falling action and a nice leisurely denouement or resolution. And, I want some time to say goodbye to these characters I've really grown to like. That's just me. So as a kind of parting thought to tie up this discussion today, while I was writing this episode, I thought of a great analogy for all of this in the form of music. So I think there's a great comparison here to make between how you pace a story to music, and specifically to dynamics within music. So something to kind of put this in perspective for you, I was a trumpet player in school, in middle school and high school and college. I played trumpet. And as a trumpet player, this is probably true for most, if not all trumpet players, I really love to play loud. The trumpet is an instrument that is really good at playing loud. It's actually more difficult to play a trumpet very softly than it is to play it very loudly. And it's a lot of fun to play loud. It's a lot of fun to be heard. It's not always very musical, though. I also, at that time, some of the music I really liked was music like metal, rock, and alternative, all of which usually sound better really loud, right? Those are music, you listen to heavy metal or hard rock or alternative, you probably like your music pretty loud. So I played trumpet. I listened to those kinds of music. I was all about loud music. I was a teenager. So when I played my trumpet, I just wanted to play loud all the time, especially in high school, before I'd learned more about music and kind of got over myself a bit. I just always wanted to play loud. And my band director is always trying to get me to play softer. But as I just said a second ago, playing loud all the time actually isn't musical at all. And the reason for that is the thing that really makes music impactful, that really makes it hit you and hit your emotions, is contrast. And I'm talking about dynamics here, which is how loud is the music. So in music, we have terms for dynamics. Piano means soft. Forte means loud. Pianissimo is really soft. Fortissimo is really loud. And then between piano and forte, you have mezzo piano, which is medium soft, and mezzo forte, which is medium loud. So a song that is loud, let's say forte, for the whole song, it's actually not that exciting. Like you might think, a song that's just really loud must be really exciting. It's not, because there's no contrast. There's no changing in dynamics. There's no changing in volume. And maybe you've noticed the phenomenon where maybe you're listening to loud music, and after you listen to it a while, it doesn't seem as loud to you, and you have to turn it up a little more if you want it to really seem like it's loud. And that's because you just get used to it. You get desensitized to it. So what's much more exciting than a song that's just loud, that's just forte through the whole song, is a song that has a lot of contrast. So a song that maybe starts loud, it starts at forte, then maybe it gets soft, it goes piano for a while, and then it jumps back to forte. That period of softness makes the loudness when it comes back sound even more loud. One of the most dramatic things you can do dynamically as far as volume in music is what's called a forte piano crescendo. And you hear this in music all the time, and it's where you hit a note forte, you hit it loud, and then you instantly drop piano soft, and then you slowly swell the volume back up. If I had my trumpet with me, I'd try to do one for you. Maybe I can try to do one with my voice. I'm still getting over this cold, so I don't know if I'll be able to do it or not. But I'll try to give you an example here. Ba, like that kind of thing. So you hit loud, instantly drop soft, and then swell. And it's much more dramatic if that swell is slower. My voice is crap right now, so I can't do it. But I mean, you're not going to hear this in like a lot of modern music, like with guitars and stuff, because it's really hard to do that with like an electric guitar or like an acoustic guitar. But if you listen to wind instruments like brass woodwinds, you listen to like classical jazz, something like that, you'll hear it all the time. So anyway, anytime you have music going from loud to soft to loud and back again, that's contrast, and that the loud parts make the soft parts sound softer. So you can really hear this kind of thing in classical music. Again, there's less of this in popular music, unfortunately. But you listen to some like Mozart, Beethoven, Dvorak, Tchaikovsky, you'll notice that in a given piece of music, there will be really, really soft sections, pianissimo, really loud sections, fortissimo, and everything in between. And it gives the music a lot of emotion, gives it a lot of contrast. The soft sections feel peaceful, restive, serene, while the loud sections sound angry or joyous, exciting, passionate. And those feelings are amplified even more when they're contrasted with one another. So to bring this back, I think the pacing in a novel is the exact same thing. A novel that moves at a breakneck pace through the entire thing is very much like a song that's loud or forte through the entire thing. It just wears you out, it deadens your ear, you get desensitized to it, and it ultimately loses some or even a lot of its impact. But a novel paced, as I've just described in this episode, is much more like a classical piece of music with peaks and valleys of loudness or dynamics or pacing. So it's very possible that all of this that I've discussed today is very self-evident to you, and you're like, no duh. But it's also possible that this may be new to you. And if it is, then a great exercise is to think about some of your favorite books and see if they're paced similar to what I've been talking about today. Or even better, reread one of your favorite books and watch how the pacing changes throughout the book as you go through it. And you may see that it follows something very similar to what I've been talking about. All right, so that is everything I have to say about that. I had a feeling that this would go long today, and lo and behold, it did. What a surprise. But I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. And again, I want to reiterate, I am not bashing thrillers or those who write them or those who enjoy reading them. It's just not my cup of tea. But I do think that it's interesting, these thoughts about pacing and how we approach it. And even within thrillers, the ones that I think are really popular and that a lot of people really like do not make the mistake of having the same breakneck pace through the entire book. They do have some contrast. They do, maybe not as much as other genres, but they do have some variety in there. A book that I often hear held up as an example of a thriller that goes too far with these techniques is the book, The Da Vinci Code, which I have not read it. I have seen the movie, but I haven't read the book. But I've heard that many times held up as an example of a book that even people who like thrillers feel goes too far with the buttons at the end of the chapter and the fast pacing, not really giving you a chance to catch up or take a breath or take a break, and where when information is given to the reader, it's very slapdash and you don't really completely understand it or understand how it's being used by the characters because it's given to you so quickly and in such a summary kind of format. So again, I'm just going by what I've read here in numerous places. I haven't actually read it myself, but I do often hear it used as an example of a book that maybe goes too far with this kind of thing. So it's definitely a thing of degree, even within the thriller genre, and there, are books that you may like more or less, depending on your own particular tastes. So, even if you're like me and you don't like books that are fast paced most of the way through, it doesn't mean that there aren't thriller books that you might not enjoy, because, there's a lot of variety within the genre, just like any genre. So yeah, I'm not trying to bash them or anything like that. But I have come to the conclusion that they're not for me as a reader and as a writer, even with their overwhelming popularity compared to other genres of fiction. I'm not really interested in writing them. But again, I do think that we can use some of those techniques that they use when it comes to our climaxes, and I'm all for doing that. But, at the end of the day, it's good to expose yourself to more types of literature, even if it ends up not being something you particularly like, because you're still going to learn something, and I've learned a lot by reading these thrillers, even though, I went into it thinking maybe I would try to write thrillers, and I came out of it basically thinking I would never want to try to write a thriller. But even so, I still learned a lot that I can apply to my own writing. And I did learn some techniques that I do want to use in my writing, even though I don't necessarily want to write a thriller per se. So I think the same is true for all of us, no matter what genre you're talking about, and no matter whether you end up really liking that genre or not, whether you're talking about, thrillers or horror or mystery or romance or whatever. I'd be willing to bet that any writer could learn something of value from any genre if they just approach it with an open mind and they read enough of it to get a good spread. Because again, there's going to be a lot of variation within a given genre. There will be some writers that are better at it and others that aren't as good at it. And there'll be writers that are just more in line with what you like and others not so much. So I guess the most important thing is to be well read and widely read, and to keep an open mind, because you never know what you might learn next. So that's going to wrap it up for me today. I would like to hear from you if you have any thoughts that you'd like to add to the discussion, or anything you'd like to share with me. You can email me at lexoutloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter @LexStarWalker. You can call my voicemail 951-465-5391, and you can join my community on Discord. You can find a link to the Discord community in the show notes at lexstarwalker.com/LOL. So I hope that you enjoyed the episode today. And if you are a fan of thrillers, I really hope you understand where I'm coming from, and you weren't offended, and just, can understand that not everything is for everybody. And, I have nothing but respect for people that are good at writing thrillers. It's not an easy thing to do, I am sure. And I don't think I'd be particularly good at it. Partly because it's just not my cup of tea, but partly because in some ways it's very different than the approach I like to take. So for those of you that do write thrillers and are good at it, you're doing something I wouldn't be able to do. So I'm not throwing any shade or not meaning to. And I hope everybody kind of can understand where I'm coming from. But if you have anything to add, I'd love to hear from you. And, maybe I can share it with the other listeners on the show. And, if you do have something that you would like to share with other listeners, I really encourage you to call my voicemail and leave a message, because that's the best way, because then I can actually use the audio in an episode, and you can talk to the listeners more directly. If you have something important that you'd like to add, maybe something I missed, maybe another perspective I haven't considered, because, at the end of the day, I'm just one guy with one perspective. And I'm sure there's a lot more out there that could be said that I haven't talked about. So if you have something like that you'd like to share with us, I would love to hear from you. But that's going to wrap it up for me today. I'll be back soon with another episode. And until then, keep writing.